Welcome back. This one gets into the weird price tag on genius and whether chaos is part of the package. We are talking jobs, Musk, teams, deadlines, and the ugly little question underneath all of it. Basically, can you build world-changing things without becoming a total nightmare? Because the answer keeps sounding like, unfortunately, maybe not. The wild part is how much of it comes back to childhood and pressure. Like, the book keeps saying the same thing in different clothes. The demons are not a side note, they are part of the engine. Which is a terrifying sentence to hear about a billionaire. Exactly, and then you start wondering if comfort makes people weak or just normal. I hate that those are somehow the options on the menu. The thing that hit me most was how both Jobs and Musk obsess over details nobody sees. The back of the fence, the hidden circuit board, the valve in the engine, all of it. Most people are celebrating the front of the house, and these guys are losing sleep over the wiring. That's the difference between caring about the product and caring about the optics. And sadly, optics are usually cheaper to manage. But the weird question is whether that obsession is trainable or just baked in. Isaacson makes it sound like it is partly temperament and partly damage, which is not exactly reassuring parenting advice. No one wants to hear, please traumatize your kid slightly for innovation. But that's almost how the conversation feels if you push it too far. I think the better framing is risk tolerance, not suffering worship. Because there is a difference between resilience and damage. And people keep trying to blur those two like it is some genius hack. It is not a hack, it is just messy human life. The team piece was huge, too, because Jobs and Musk are almost opposites there. Jobs builds this lasting bench. Musk builds a hardcore mission unit. One guy is assembling a dynasty, the other is assembling a siege crew. That is actually perfect, and probably why one feels calmer on paper. Jobs cared about the team surviving him. Musk cares about the mission surviving the week. And that is both impressive and kind of unstable. Because if the whole thing depends on one brain, that is not really a system. It is a machine with one hand on every lever, which works until that hand twitches at 2 a.m. And then the whole internet gets a live demo of your mood swings. That part was uncomfortable, honestly, the way his mental state is described. The catatonic, manic, self-destructive cycles are not glamorous at all. It makes you ask if the volatility is incidental or central. And Isaacson basically says, maybe you cannot separate them cleanly. That is the whole nightmare, because the good and bad are braided together. Like the same guy who pushes rockets into orbit is also wrecking his own night. Evolution is not known for tasteful packaging. That should be on the back cover of every billionaire biography. The algorithm stuff was fascinating, too, because it sounds simple until you actually try it. Question every rule, simplify everything, speed it up, then automate. That is basically first principles with a caffeine problem. It really is just first principles screaming at people. But it does explain why he keeps winning in places where others get polite and stuck. He does not respect process unless process can justify itself physically. If the rule has no physics behind it, he wants it gone. Which is great unless the rule exists because humans are clumsy animals. And humans are absolutely clumsy animals. That is where manufacturing becomes the real story, not just product design. He is watching the line, watching the bolts, watching the bottlenecks. That is such an unglamorous source of power. Meanwhile, most CEOs are still talking about vision decks. Vision deck is such a fake phrase, I cannot even recover from that. The deadlines thing was another massive theme. He uses deadlines like a whip and a compass at the same time. And somehow the teams still move. Not because the deadlines are realistic, but because they are catalytic. That is a very expensive way to motivate people, though. Yes, and probably exhausting for everyone except the guy yelling Friday. The question is whether urgency produces excellence or just panic. And the answer seems to be both, depending on the day. That is the most annoying, honest answer possible. What I liked is that Isaacson never pretends the risk-taking is clean. Starship explodes, and then somehow that still counts as progress. Only in Silicon Valley does a fireball qualify as a milestone. It is insane, but also not totally insane if the data is real. The question is where risk becomes arrogance. That line keeps moving when the stakes are huge. And when it moves, everybody else pays the tuition. Especially in public companies, which makes it messier. Then there is the happiness question, which he basically rejects. He sounds almost allergic to calm. Calm would probably feel like a software bug to him. That is brutal, but yes, exactly. He seems addicted to the next level, not the reward screen. Jobs had that too, right? Totally. Because the iPod success immediately became a threat in his mind. He could not even enjoy winning before cannibalizing himself. Which is absurd, but also why these people move faster than normal humans. Normal humans need a dinner and a nap after winning. Normal humans need a therapist after one launch. The Bezos contrast was useful because it showed a different relationship to success. Bezos seems to enjoy the yacht energy a bit more. He does seem spiritually attached to vacation homes. That line about getting off the yacht more often was vicious. But it also points to a real trade-off between comfort and ambition. Would you rather be happier or more obsessive and more consequential? That is a nasty question because it is not hypothetical. It is the whole book, really, just dressed up as biography. And the ending lands on know thyself, which feels almost boring until you think about it. Because knowing your mission is one thing, but knowing your limits is the real flex. He says his own mission is storytelling, not rockets. That part I actually loved, because it is humble without being small. He sees stories as a way of passing values forward, which is kind of the opposite of the Musk model, where the machine is the message. Storytellers do not usually need a launch tower to prove a point. Thank God, because the insurance would be a nightmare. I think that is why the series worked so well overall. It kept asking what parts of greatness we should actually copy. And the answer is not all of them, obviously. Maybe copy the focus, the standards, the courage. Do not copy the sleep deprivation and emotional wreckage. Please, nobody needs a founder starter pack of misery. If you had to take one thing from this episode, what would it be? For me, it is that ambition without self-knowledge gets dangerous fast. And that talent is never as clean as people want it to be. Yeah, and I think the real ending is that genius is not permission to be careless. Exactly, it is just a more expensive version of being human. All right, that wraps the last one, and I think we leave people with a good headache. A productive headache, hopefully. Thanks for riding through the whole series with us. That was fun, messy, and honestly a little humbling. Welcome back, and this last one is really about genius, chaos, and what intensity actually costs. We are basically asking whether the same fire that builds rockets also burns down the room. Which is a very efficient way to ruin a dinner party, by the way. The wild part is how much of that fire seems tied to pain, not comfort. And that is where people get uncomfortable because they want the hero story without the damage. Right, they want the product without the person. Which is impossible because the person is the product engine. Jobs had the obsession with beauty, even the hidden parts. The back of the fence problem is such a perfect job story. It is basically, if you are sloppy where nobody looks, you are sloppy everywhere. And Musk takes that into manufacturing, where every bolt becomes a moral issue. Every valve is suddenly a personality test. If the valve is late, your soul is late too. That is exactly the vibe, though. What I keep coming back to is that both guys treated details like destiny. But one did it through design purity, and the other through execution violence. Execution violence is a horrible phrase and also somehow accurate. That is the cleanest way to say it without getting punched. Musk does not sound like someone who believes in comfort as a value. He sounds like someone who treats comfort as a trap. And that makes sense if your whole childhood felt like survival. That is the part people flatten too much because they think volatility is just arrogance. But a lot of it looks more like unresolved damage with a spaceship attached. Unresolved damage with a spaceship attached is honestly the most modern sentence possible. And the scary thing is, it works often enough that everyone excuses the rest. That is the bargain, right? You tolerate a lot because the upside is absurd. But then you ask, tolerated by whom? Because the team pays too. That is the thing about the word team in this conversation. Jobs built teams that could outlive him, and Musk builds missions that can survive him. Not always the same thing, though. Exactly, because a mission can be bigger than the org chart. But a good team is the org chart turning into reality. And Musk is kind of allergic to letting that happen elegantly. Elegantly is not his brand, no. He uses deadlines like a crowbar. Not because he expects perfection, but because he wants panic to create motion. Which is a very expensive way to manage anxiety. Bro is basically industrializing stress. And to be fair, sometimes that is exactly what breakthroughs need. Sometimes not as a religion, Yes, because once the culture worships urgency, everything becomes an emergency. And then nobody knows what calm looks like anymore. That part felt almost sad to me. It is sad because he does not seem to value happiness as a destination. He literally described life like a video game with worse sleep. That might be the most relatable billionaire thing he has ever said. But the difference is most people want the game to end at some point. He just keeps clicking next level like the universe owes him a boss fight. And honestly, that is exhausting just hearing about it. I need a nap after reading about his Tuesday. What also stands out is how much he hates complacency. Even when something is wildly successful, he immediately moves to cannibalize it. That is such a Jobs move too, honestly. If you do not eat your own lunch, somebody else will. Great slogan for a company, terrible slogan for a therapist. Absolutely catastrophic in couples counseling. And that brings us to the private life part, which is where the whole thing gets messier. Because the same intensity that helps him build also seems to wreck intimacy. He seems drawn to drama the way other people are drawn to sunlight. And that is not just a preference, that is a pattern. Right, and the pattern keeps showing up in love, in work, in conflict. Which means the issue is not the relationship, it is the operating system. But then you hear about Tallulah Riley and it gets complicated again. Because not every strong person is built for the same kind of weather. That is a very polite way to say she was not interested in living inside a tornado. Extremely fair, honestly. And that is the point. He keeps needing intensity, but intensity keeps charging rent. The rent is paid by the people closest to him. Exactly. And that is where admiration starts to become moral discomfort. Because you can respect the achievement and still hate the method. Completely. And Walter was pretty honest about that tension. He admired the result, but he did not romanticize the price. Which is rare because most people either worship or cancel. He stayed inside the contradiction, and that is why the book feels alive. Also because he actually understands that these people are not action figures. They are just extremely expensive humans with bigger mistakes. That is the whole thesis for me. Extraordinary output does not erase ordinary frailty. It often magnifies it. Yes, and the bigger the stage, the louder the cracks. That is why the hardship conversation matters so much. Because people keep asking if suffering is necessary for greatness. I do not think suffering is the goal, but resilience usually comes from friction. There is a huge difference between friction and trauma, though. Huge difference, and we should not confuse the two just because the outcomes look shiny. Exactly, because some people survive pain and become generous, and some become hurricanes. That is a brutal binary, but yes. And as parents, that is the scary part, because you cannot engineer a genius without touching the fire. But you also cannot call every harshness noble just because it produces output. That is the fake wisdom people love to sell. The real wisdom is probably knowing where your own line is. Walter basically said that too in his own way. He can admire Musk and still say, that price is too high for me. That honesty is rare and kind of beautiful, because it lets you take lessons without turning somebody into a saint. And that is what this whole series has been about for me. Not copying the person, but extracting the principle. Like assembling your own little Frankenstein of traits. A tasteful Frankenstein, hopefully. Preferably with better sleep and fewer lawsuits. Already ahead of Elon on one of those. That is true, and maybe more than one. The closing answer from Walter was actually the cleanest possible end to this series. Know yourself, know your mission, and then let the happiness follow. That feels almost boring until you realize how few people do it. Exactly, because most people are trying to borrow a mission from the room. Or borrow an identity from somebody louder than them. And then they wonder why they feel fake. Because they are living like an audition tape. Brutal, but fair. If there is one thing I hope people take from the whole run, it is that ambition needs a mirror. Otherwise, you just become efficient at becoming unhappy. And that is a terrible trade. Yeah, especially when the world keeps clapping for the wrong parts. But at least now people can see the whole shape a little more clearly. That feels like a good place to land the plane. A very chaotic plane, but we landed it. Thanks for being here through all 3 episodes. It has been messy, honest, and weirdly useful. We will catch you next time. Welcome back, because this one gets into the genius and the damage at the same time. We are in the part where success looks amazing and also kind of terrifying. The wild thing is how often the same trait is both the engine and the wound. And that is where people start pretending they want the truth, but they really want a clean story. Yeah, they want the hoodie version of genius, not the meltdown version. Walter keeps forcing the ugly question, what if the chaos is part of the output? Because with Musk, it is not just ambition, it is volatility baked into the machine. He does not exactly seem like a man who does yoga at sunrise and journals. Not a single part of that sentence felt remotely possible. But that absence of calm is part of the picture, and that is uncomfortable. The book keeps hinting that the demon mode is not a glitch. It is a pattern. And then people around him keep managing the smoke after the fire starts. Which is why I keep coming back to the team thing, because one person cannot carry that alone. Exactly, and Jobs understood that earlier than almost anyone. He was obsessed with making the team the product, not just the product the product. That sounds insane, but also very Apple in the most Apple way possible. Joni Ive, Eddie Q, Phil Schiller, Tim Cook, that was the real machine. Musk builds brilliant teams too, but he seems less interested in shared ownership. He gives you a mission and a deadline and maybe a small crisis for motivation. Maybe a small crisis is doing a lot of work there. No, but seriously, the difference matters because succession matters. If you leave Apple, there is a spine of leadership that still functions. If Musk leaves, you feel the whole thing lean much harder on him. That is power, but it is also fragility masquerading as strength. And the detail obsession is where it gets really interesting. Jobs cared about the hidden circuit board, and Musk cared about the hidden valve leak. That is such a powerful contrast, because both of them refuse invisible sloppiness. They are both almost insulted by the idea that no one will notice. Which is great until you are the poor person in the meeting getting grilled over a screw. Poor person in the meeting is basically an endangered species in those rooms. But that is also where the manufacturing obsession comes in for Musk. He does not treat engineering and production like separate universes. He wants the people designing the thing staring straight at the line. That is the whole first principles thing, stripped down and made physical. Question every rule, then simplify, then speed up, then automate. It sounds like the cleanest chaos management framework ever invented. But the danger is obvious. You can automate nonsense if you never deleted it. And that is where his speed becomes either genius or wreckage. Sometimes both before lunch. Absolutely, by noon, somebody has built the future and broken the org chart. The risk-taking piece is what most people admire from a distance. Starship explodes and he calls it progress because he is collecting information. That is only inspiring if you are not the person standing next to the explosion. Or paying for the explosion, which is even less inspirational. Still, there is something real about refusing to worship safety as a virtue. He thinks failure is cheap if it teaches you the shape of the next attempt. That is very different from Boeing or NASA culture, and he knows it. It is also why he creates such a wake of rubble behind him. Right, because 80% success sounds heroic until you zoom in on the 20%. The 20% is where everybody else is stuck cleaning the floor. The floor, the lawsuit, the tweet, the morale, all of it. And then there is the deadline obsession, which is kind of its own religion. Deadlines are basically his way of making the impossible feel embarrassed. That is a terrifying management philosophy, honestly. But it works because he turns pressure into momentum instead of paralysis. The team calls them surges, which already sounds like a battlefield term. Which is fitting because normal human pacing is not welcome there. Normal human pacing gets escorted out of the building immediately. And still, none of that adds up to happiness for him. That answer surprised me less the more I sat with it. He does not even rank happiness very high, which is a strange kind of honesty. Most people are pretending they are chasing purpose when they are really chasing comfort. Jobs was similar, though, in that he could never stop at the win. He kept fearing cannibalization, which is a very ruthless form of self-awareness. Basically, eat yourself before the market eats you. That is a disgusting slogan, but yes, spiritually accurate. Bezos is the interesting foil because he seems more willing to savor the trophies. And Musk looks at that life like, why would I want that? Though he absolutely still wants Bezos to build more rockets, because competition sharpens him. That is the most backhanded compliment possible. Get off your yacht and help me improve space travel, buddy. But it shows how these people think in ecosystems, not friendships. They are rivals, but they are also weirdly dependent on each other. The same logic shows up in his relationships, which is where the book gets more painful. He is drawn to drama because drama feels like home to him. That is such a brutal sentence, but it seems true. The intensity he brings to companies shows up in love, marriage, and parenting too. And the saddest part is that he seems terrified of being alone. That childhood loneliness explains a lot without excusing everything. Exactly, because explanation is not the same thing as absolution. Tallulah Riley stands out because she sounds like calm in human form, which frankly must have felt like alien technology to him. A functioning relationship with peace in it probably scared him a little. But that is where this tragedy lives, because the best thing for him is not the thing he wants. And that is true for a lot of people, just on a smaller scale. We all have versions of that trade-off, just without the rockets. The difference is, most of us are not scaling our unresolved issues into public infrastructure. Thank God, because my unresolved issues should not be near factories. What I kept taking from Walter is the idea that you cannot separate gift from scar. That is the real thesis under all the biography glitter. The brilliance is powered by the same wiring that makes them hard to live with. And once you accept that, the myth gets a lot more human. Which is probably the point of the whole series, honestly. Not to worship these people, but to understand the price tag. And maybe to ask what parts of that intensity we actually need. Because not everybody needs trauma as a product feature. Please, let us all agree on that one. You can want excellence without wanting the emotional wreckage attached to it. That is the healthier lesson here, if people are willing to hear it. And that feels like the right place to wrap the whole trilogy. We started with the myth and we end with the bill. A very expensive bill, emotionally and otherwise. Thanks for sticking with us through all 3 episodes. We will catch you next time.